The galaxy had always been a place of immense diversity, filled with countless civilizations, each claiming their own superiority. Yet there was one race that had long been dismissed as weak, considered beneath the notice of the powerful empires that governed the stars. The Rynians were small, frail creatures, nothing more than harmless scavengers. Their homeworld, a barren rock far from the galactic center, was seen as insignificant by everyone. They existed in the margins of space, overlooked by the grandiose forces that waged wars and established dominions across the stars. It was from this obscurity that Kale, a former soldier of the Galactic Council, had arrived on Rynia. His mission was supposed to be straightforward: observe, report, and then leave. The Council had tasked him with monitoring the Rynians, assuming they posed no threat. To the Council, they were a relic, a race doomed to extinction. But Kale couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to them than met the eye. When Kale first set foot on Rynia, he was met with a world unlike anything he had expected. The landscape was barren and desolate, with vast stretches of cracked earth stretching out as far as the eye could see. The sky was a dull shade of orange, the sun casting long shadows over the ruins of once thriving cities that now lay in ruins. The Rynians lived in these ruins, scavenging what little they could from the remnants of their former civilization. Kale was used to working among more formidable species, ones that wielded advanced technology, powerful armies, and vast empires. The Rynians had none of that. They were weak, or so it seemed. Yet, as Kale moved deeper into their settlements, he couldn't shake the sense that there was something unique about them. They watched him with wary eyes, their small forms moving swiftly through the ruins like shadows. It was almost as if they knew more than they let on. His first encounter with a Rynian had been both confusing and unsettling. The creature had appeared suddenly, small and wiry, with dull gray fur and piercing, intelligent eyes. It had approached him with a calm demeanor, ignoring the weapon strapped to Kale's armor. The Rynian hadn't seemed afraid, nor had it shown any signs of submission. Instead, it had studied him, tilting its head as if trying to comprehend what it saw. Kale had expected fear, resistance, or perhaps hostility. But there had been none of that. The Rynian had simply watched him, as if considering what to do next. The encounter had left Kale feeling off balance. These creatures were supposed to be weak, insignificant. Yet something about their gaze told him otherwise. Over time, Kale's presence on Rynia became a source of both curiosity and tension. The Rynians didn't trust him, and they didn't welcome him. They saw him as a stranger, an outsider whose intentions were unclear. But Kale wasn't there to impose his will. He wanted answers. The Rynians weren't like the other races he had encountered. There was something different about them, something hidden beneath their frail exterior. It wasn't long before Kale began to notice strange patterns in their behavior. The Rynians had little to no technology, at least, none that could compare to the advanced devices wielded by other races. Yet, they were remarkably resourceful. They scavenged not only from the remnants of their own world but also from the ruins left behind by other civilizations. Tools, weapons, and artifacts from long-forgotten empires lay scattered across Rynia, and the Rynians collected them with precision. What Kale found most surprising was their knowledge. They didn't just use these remnants, they understood how they worked. They rebuilt, modified, and adapted what little they had into tools and weapons far beyond what Kale had imagined they could create. It wasn't advanced technology, but it was effective. The Rynians didn't merely survive, they thrived, despite everything they had lost. Kale couldn't ignore the growing realization that these creatures were far from weak. Their scavenging wasn't the desperate act of a dying race. It was a testament to their resourcefulness. The Rynians didn't need the powerful machines of other species to survive. They had something far more valuable, an uncanny ability to adapt, to learn, and to thrive in ways that defied the expectations of the galaxy's powerful empires. As Kale observed them, he began to understand the stakes. The Council had dismissed the Rynians as insignificant, but Kale knew better now. They were anything but. Their survival wasn't just a miracle, it was a testament to something much greater than anyone had anticipated. The Rynians had survived for centuries in the face of extinction, not by chance, but by their sheer will to endure. The more Kale learned, the more he realized that the Rynians' survival wasn't a weakness, it was their strength. And now, as Kale faced the possibility of his mission's failure, he knew one thing for certain: the Rynians were far from the race the galaxy had written off. They weren't weak. They were stronger than anyone had ever imagined. The dust swirled in the air, settling over the barren landscape of Rynia. Kale stood at the edge of a massive ravine, staring into the endless emptiness before him. The world had only grown more desolate since his arrival. The Rynians, small, frail creatures, were proving far more resilient than anyone had predicted. But resilience wasn't enough. The stakes were rising, and Kale knew that the true test of their survival had yet to come. Since his initial encounter with the Rynians, Kale had spent weeks observing them from the shadows. At first, he believed they were simply scavengers, eking out a meager existence in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. But now, he understood they were something far more dangerous than the Galactic Council had ever realized. The Rynians weren't just surviving, they were adapting. And that adaptability was proving to be a threat. The first sign of trouble had come during his latest patrol. A Rynian settlement that had once appeared fragile had become something far more organized. The ruins, once scattered and chaotic, now bore evidence of careful planning. Structures had been rebuilt, modified using salvaged materials, blending the old and the new. Weapons, crude but functional, were scattered across the area, remnants of a time long past but now repurposed. Kale had watched in silence as Rynians armed themselves, the sharp glint of sharpened metal in their hands. They didn't need advanced technology to defend themselves. They had found ways to make do with what they had, creating tools that were far more effective than anything Kale had anticipated. His presence had only intensified their vigilance. The Rynians, once timid and cautious, had begun to move differently. They no longer cowered in the ruins but moved with purpose, their gazes now hardened. They watched everything, noting his every movement, observing his equipment, learning from him in ways he couldn't comprehend. Kale had spent years fighting larger, more powerful races, ones that viewed themselves as superior. Yet none of them had ever faced a foe like the Rynians. They weren't large, nor did they possess technological marvels. But they had something the galaxy's most advanced civilizations lacked: an unmatched resilience born from desperation and ingenuity. As Kale continued his observations, he began to notice shifts in their behavior. The Rynians weren't simply scavenging for survival anymore. They were building something that went beyond mere existence. They had begun to understand the very tools and technologies once deemed foreign to them. They had begun to innovate, to push beyond what Kale thought was possible. It wasn't just their weaponry that had evolved. The Rynians were improving at an alarming rate. Their once fragile frames now moved with unexpected agility. They learned from Kale's equipment, dismantling his discarded weapons, reverse engineering their use, and refining them into tools more effective than he had ever seen. Kale had tried to remain detached, to observe without interfering. But as days turned into weeks, he began to realize something disturbing. The Rynians weren't merely surviving, they were thriving. And they were doing so without the help of the Council or the powerful empires that ruled the galaxy. Their strength didn't come from technology or numbers, but from something far deeper: their ability to adapt and survive against all odds. His thoughts often drifted to the day he had first encountered the Rynian leader, a creature smaller than him, but somehow commanding a presence far greater than his own. The Rynian had approached him without fear, studying him as if measuring the odds. It had left him with the distinct impression that the Rynians had known of his arrival long before he had stepped foot on Rynia. Kale had dismissed it at first, attributing it to luck or coincidence. But now, as he observed their growing strength, he realized that the Rynians had always been more aware, more attuned to their surroundings than the Council had believed. Their resilience wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. The conflict wasn't just about survival anymore. It had become something far more profound. The Rynians weren't just adapting, they were evolving. And they were becoming a force to be reckoned with. Kale couldn't ignore the implications. If the Rynians continued to evolve at this pace, they wouldn't remain the weak, insignificant race the galaxy had dismissed. They would become something far greater, something unstoppable. The Council had been wrong. The Rynians weren't just surviving, they were transforming. And Kale knew the galaxy would never look at them the same way again. The storm had arrived. Kale stood at the edge of a battlefield unlike any he had ever known. The once fragile and scattered Rynian settlements had become fortified outposts, their structures now bristling with crude but effective defenses. The Rynians, once meek and unnoticed, were now organized and lethal. They moved as a unit, fighting with a precision and determination that Kale hadn't expected. The signs had been there for weeks: small skirmishes, tactical advancements, the constant hum of activity as they refined their methods of warfare. But now, all of it had escalated. The Rynians were no longer scavengers. They were soldiers, disciplined and driven by something far beyond the desperation that had once defined them. Kale had underestimated them. It wasn't the first time he had made that mistake, but this time, the consequences felt far more dire. The Rynians had transformed, not just physically but mentally. Their once timid and cautious behavior had been replaced by something fiercer: purpose, resilience, and an uncanny knack for survival. The sight of them now was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Small, wiry creatures, they moved like shadows through the rubble-strewn battlefield. They fought with weapons that should have been far less effective but had somehow become deadly. Simple blades, improvised firearms, and crude explosive devices had become tools of destruction in their hands. Kale had seen many races rise to power, but none had done so with such speed and efficiency. The Rynians were no longer weak. They were no longer dependent on the leftovers of others. They had become something entirely their own, dangerous, unpredictable, and unstoppable. Their leader, the one who had first confronted Kale, now stood at the forefront of this transformation. The Rynian, small, agile, and relentless, led them with a quiet intensity. Kale had tried to ignore him at first, dismissing him as just another survivor clinging to the past. But now, he saw the truth. The Rynian leader wasn't just a survivor, he was a visionary. The conflict had reached its breaking point, and Kale knew it. The Rynians were no longer fighting for scraps of survival. They were fighting for something far greater: their independence, their identity, and their place in the galaxy. And in that fight, Kale realized they had become something more than anyone could have predicted. The battlefield was a mess of destruction. Smoke rose from the ruins as Kale watched the Rynians charge forward, their small forms moving with surprising speed and precision. They were no longer fleeing or hiding. They were taking the fight to their enemies, to anyone who had once looked down upon them as weak. Kale could feel the tide shifting. The once dismissed Rynians were no longer mere scavengers. They had become a force capable of standing tall against the very powers that had once ruled the galaxy. And in that realization, Kale knew there was no going back. He had always believed in the strength of the powerful empires, the dominance of those with vast resources and advanced technology. But now, standing amidst the chaos, he saw something different. The Rynians didn't need those things. They had something far more powerful: the will to survive and the ability to adapt. As the battle raged around him, Kale found himself questioning everything he had once believed. The Council had dismissed the Rynians as weak, but they had been wrong. The galaxy had dismissed them, and now they were paying the price. Kale had come to Rynia to observe, to report, and to ensure the safety of the Council's interests. But now, as the conflict reached its climax, he realized his mission had shifted. It wasn't about protecting the interests of an empire that had long since lost its relevance. It was about survival, his and theirs. The Rynians had stopped being the weak, insignificant creatures the galaxy had written off. They had become something far more dangerous, unstoppable. And Kale knew that if they succeeded in their quest for independence, the galaxy would never be the same again. The battle was over. Kale stood amidst the silence, the once chaotic battlefield now still and empty. The smoke had cleared, revealing the aftermath of the conflict that had reshaped Rynia. What had once been a desperate, fragmented race had now emerged as something different, something unstoppable. The Rynians had won. But it wasn't a victory driven by brute force or overwhelming numbers. It was a victory forged from something far deeper: resilience, ingenuity, and unity. Kale had watched as they adapted to every challenge, turning their weaknesses into strengths. And now, they stood as a force to be reckoned with, not just surviving but thriving. Kale had expected the Rynians to crumble under the weight of the galaxy's expectations. He had expected them to remain as they had always been, forgotten, overlooked, and insignificant. But they hadn't. They had proven him, and the Council, completely wrong. The Rynian leader, the one who had first confronted Kale, now stood before him. There was no longer the quiet, cautious figure Kale had once seen. This was a leader transformed, a figure of strength and vision, his once meek demeanor replaced by something far more commanding. Kale approached him, his steps cautious. The leader regarded him with calm, unreadable eyes. There was no fear now, no hesitation. Just confidence. "We've won," the leader said softly, his voice carrying the weight of countless battles fought and endured. Kale hesitated. "You've transformed," he admitted. "I didn't expect this." The Rynian leader nodded. "No one did." Kale struggled to find the right words. The galaxy had long since dismissed the Rynians as weak, insignificant creatures. But now, they had risen from the ashes and proved the Council's assumptions wrong. "Why didn't you fight like this before? Why did you let them believe you were powerless?" The leader studied him for a moment. "We didn't need to fight," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "We needed to survive." Kale frowned, unsure of what he was hearing. "But why? Why not fight sooner? Why wait?" The leader looked toward the horizon, where the remnants of their civilization stretched out. "Because survival wasn't enough," he said. "We were scavengers, lost in the ruins of our past. But now, we've found something more. We've found purpose." Kale was silent, absorbing the leader's words. It wasn't about survival anymore. The Rynians had moved beyond that. They weren't just scavenging from the wreckage of their world, they were rebuilding from it. They had adapted, learned, and evolved into something far greater than Kale had ever believed possible. The Rynians hadn't just reclaimed their home, they had reclaimed their pride, their identity. And in doing so, they had changed the galaxy's perception of them forever. The leader turned back to Kale, his eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "The galaxy dismissed us as weak. They thought we'd die out in the shadows. But they were wrong. We're not just surviving anymore. We're thriving." Kale nodded slowly, the weight of what he had witnessed settling over him. The Rynians weren't the weak race the galaxy had dismissed. They were something far more formidable, unstoppable. The leader extended his hand. "Join us," he said. "Together, we will show the galaxy that survival isn't enough. It's about thriving." Kale hesitated for a moment before reaching out, shaking the Rynian's hand. In that simple act, he knew the galaxy was about to change. The Rynians had stopped being the race everyone had written off. They had become something far greater and unstoppable.